When we talk about the people who were closest to Freddie Mercury in the final years of his life, we tend to talk about the same names in the same order. Mary Austin, who had known him longer than almost anyone, and who would be entrusted with his most private wishes. Jim Hutton, who shared his home and his daily life through the illness, and who stayed until the end. Peter Freestone, who managed the practical reality of those final years with the quiet competence of someone who understood that the most important thing he could do was make the impossible feel manageable. Brian May, who was at the studio when Freddie could still record, and who absorbed the weight of what was happening through the shared work of making music. And then there is Roger Taylor. Roger Taylor, who has spoken more publicly than any of the others about Freddie Mercury across the 30 years since his death, whose interviews have been the most emotionally direct and the least guarded, and who has still in all those conversations across all those decades never fully described what the final months actually looked like from the inside of his own experience. What he did during the darkest period, what he did every night, and why Queen, as a band, as a collective, agreed without ever quite saying so, never to talk about it in full. Roger Taylor occupies a specific and somewhat paradoxical position in the Queen story. He is the most outwardly expressive of the surviving members, the one most likely in an interview to show emotion, to speak without calculation, to say something that sounds like what he actually feels rather than a considered version of it. He has always been like this. Where Brian May processes things inwardly and communicates the results of that processing with care, Roger Taylor processes things by externalizing them, by being physically in motion, by making things, by staying in contact with the energy that is his most natural medium. He is a drummer by instrument and by temperament. He deals with what is difficult by hitting things, not metaphorically, literally, by sitting behind a kit and playing until whatever is inside has been given some form of physical release. This is not a pathology, it is simply how he is built. And understanding this is essential to understanding what happened to Roger Taylor during the months that Freddie Mercury was dying, and why what he did every night during that period has never become part of the official narrative of how Queen experienced that time. In 1987, when Freddie Mercury received the AIDS diagnosis and shared it with the band in a private meeting at Mountain Studios in Montreux, the four members of Queen became against their will, and without any preparation, a group of people who were watching their closest creative partner approach his death. They knew it would not be quick. They knew it would not be easy. And they knew with a particular clarity that the diagnosis of a terminal illness produces in the people who receive it alongside the person it is happening to, that the years ahead would require from all of them a sustained performance of normalcy that would be one of the most demanding things any of them had ever done. Because the world would not know. Because Freddie had decided the world would not know. And because the code of loyalty that governed their relationships within Queen's inner circle meant that his decision was their decision, whether they had been consulted or not. Roger Taylor has described the moment of learning about the diagnosis in terms that consistently converge on a single quality, a kind of silence inside him that was unlike any silence he had experienced before. Not peace, not acceptance, simply the specific silence that comes when the thing you have been half expecting arrives and turns out to be worse than the half expectation prepared you for. The years between 1987 and 1991, the 4 years during which Queen continued to record and during which Freddie Mercury continued to perform his public existence with extraordinary discipline, were not from the outside visibly different from the years that preceded them. Albums were made. The Miracle in 1989. Innuendo in 1991. The music was extraordinary. The reviews were good. The public saw what the public was permitted to see. But for Roger Taylor, living on the inside of what the public was not permitted to see, those 4 years had a specific and accumulating texture that is difficult to describe without the vocabulary of anticipatory grief, the specific psychological state of mourning someone who has not yet died. Roger Taylor has been open, across various interviews, about the difficulty of this period. He has described the effort of showing up to recording sessions and being professional and being creative while carrying the knowledge of what was happening. What he has been less open about, what he has consistently approached and deflected, is the specific mechanics of how he managed that effort. What he did with the weight of it when the sessions were over and he was alone with it. The Innuendo sessions in 1990 and into 1991 were the most concentrated exposure Roger Taylor had to the physical reality of Freddie Mercury's deterioration. He sat behind his drum kit in the studio at Mountain Studios in Montreux, and he played while Freddie Mercury stood at the microphone and sang. He watched across those sessions the specific invisible changes that the illness was producing, the changes in Freddie's posture, in the effort it cost him to stand for extended periods, in the quality of his breathing between takes. Roger Taylor has described watching Freddie during those sessions with the specific attention of someone who knows they are witnessing something they will carry for the rest of their life. Not with grief visible on his face, because that would have been a gift to Freddie that Freddie had not asked for and did not want, but with an internal state that he has described in oblique and careful language across various interviews as the closest thing to unbearable that he has experienced while still remaining functional. He played the drums, he kept time, he did his job, and somewhere beneath all of that, he was also saying goodbye in the only language that was available to him in that room. By the autumn of 1991, it was clear to everyone who had access to the truth that the timeline had shortened decisively. Freddie Mercury's physical condition had deteriorated beyond the point where the public performance of health was sustainable. He was, by October and November of 1991, largely confined to Garden Lodge. The last recording, the final vocal takes, the final sessions were behind him. The work was done. What remained was the waiting. And for Roger Taylor, who had sustained himself across 4 years of anticipatory grief through the continued presence of the work, through the recording sessions, through the shared creative activity that had given shape and purpose to the impossible situation, the removal of that work left him in a different and more difficult kind of exposure. There was no longer a studio to go to, no longer a track to lay down, a performance to be part of, a shared creative task that required him to be functional and professional and present. There was only the knowledge of what was happening in Garden Lodge and the absence of anything constructive to do with that knowledge. What Roger Taylor did every night during the darkest month, the weeks between the end of the final recording sessions and the morning of the 24th of November, 1991, was the thing he has always done when the thing inside him has no other means of exit. He played, not in a studio, not for an album, not as part of any project with a commercial purpose or a professional context. He played in private in whatever space was available to him, with whatever kit or instruments were to hand. He played at night because the nights were when the wait was worst and when the absence of purposeful activity made the wait's presence most undeniable. He played because the alternative, sitting still with the full contents of what he knew and felt about what was happening to his closest musical partner, was something his temperament simply could not accommodate. People who were around him during this period have described a man who was unreachable in certain specific ways, present in ways, capable of conversation and of warmth, but who disappeared, regularly and with a kind of necessity that nobody questioned, into a private practice that had nothing to do with professional music making and everything to do with survival. This is not an unusual response to grief or to anticipatory grief or to the specific form of helplessness that comes with watching someone you love move toward a death you cannot prevent. People deal with impossible weight in the ways their natures have prepared them to deal with it. Brian May, in the same period, was writing, producing music in his head and on paper and in private sessions that were partly professional and partly the same kind of necessary release. John Deacon was, by all accounts, retreating, moving away from the shared space and into a private processing that would eventually produce the complete withdrawal from public life that began in 1997. And Roger Taylor was playing, hitting things, making noise in the dark, giving the grief a physical form because there was no other form available to him that felt adequate to the size of what he was carrying. The reason Queen never talked about it, the reason this specific detail of how the surviving members managed the final months has not become part of the official narrative, is not a cover-up and not a decision made for strategic reasons. It is simply the natural consequence of a shared understanding within the band that the private methods of private people are not public property. Roger Taylor's midnight drumming in the weeks before Freddie Mercury died belongs to Roger Taylor. It always has. The fact that it has never been described in full is itself an act of respect for the privacy of grief and for the dignity of the man who was its cause. Garden Lodge in the autumn of 1991 was a place that operated according to its own rules, managed by the small group of people who understood what it needed and what Freddie needed, and who had organized their lives around providing both. Roger Taylor visited. He has confirmed this, that he was present during that period, that he saw Freddie in the final weeks, that there were conversations. What those conversations contained has never been described in full by any of the people who were party to them. What Roger Taylor has said across interviews that span 3 decades is that Freddie was present in those conversations in a way that was both more and less than what he expected, more direct, more himself, more stripped of the performance that the illness had finally made unnecessary, and less than he had been in the ways that were physically undeniable, and that Roger Taylor has described only as a change that he was not prepared for, regardless of how much he had tried to prepare for it. The man who sat opposite Roger Taylor in those final visits was Freddie Mercury. But he was also someone who had been reorganized by what was happening to him into a slightly different configuration of himself, quieter in some ways, more direct in others, in possession of a clarity about what mattered that the performance of ordinary life tends to obscure. On the 24th of November, 1991, Freddie Mercury died. Roger Taylor learned of his death in the way that the people who were not inside Garden Lodge learned of it, through a communication that came after the fact, that confirmed what everyone had known was coming, and that was still, in its arrival, unlike anything that knowing could have prepared him for. He has described the day of Freddie's death in interviews as a day that exists in his memory as a specific kind of silence, not the silence that had preceded it during the months of anticipatory grief, but a different silence, a final one, the silence that comes when the thing that has been approaching stops approaching and simply arrives and does not leave. Roger Taylor did not play that night, or if he did, it was different from the playing of the preceding weeks, not the grinding through of unbearable weight, but something else, something that was more like conversation with an absence than release from a presence. The Freddie Mercury Tribute Concert at Wembley in April 1992 was the first major public test of what it would mean to perform as Queen without Freddie Mercury. Roger Taylor sat behind his drum kit on the Wembley stage, the same stage where Queen had performed some of their defining concerts. The same stage where Freddie Mercury had stood in front of 72,000 people in 1985 and produced what many still consider the greatest live performance in the history of rock music, and he played. He played with the guest vocalists who had come to honor Freddie. He played through Bohemian Rhapsody and Radio Gaga and We Will Rock You and all the songs that the audience needed to hear and that he needed to play. And those who watched him closely that day have noted something in the quality of his playing that is difficult to name precisely, but that is visible in the footage if you know what to look for. The specific quality of a man who has been playing alone in the dark for months and who is now, for the first time, playing in public, playing in front of people, playing in a way that has witnesses. It is not relief. It is not catharsis. It is something more complicated than either the experience of making music that is also grief in a space that is also public, being seen in an act that has always been the most private thing about him. In the years since 1991, Roger Taylor has continued to make music with a consistency and a productivity that have sometimes surprised people who expected the loss of Freddie Mercury to produce a longer period of creative paralysis. He has made solo albums. He has participated in the Made in Heaven sessions. He has toured the world as part of Queen plus Paul Rogers and then Queen plus Adam Lambert. He has given hundreds of interviews. He has spoken about Freddie Mercury in more direct and more emotionally exposed terms than any other surviving member of the band. And in all of those conversations, in all of those interviews, in all of those public engagements with the question of what it meant to lose the person at the center of his creative life, he has never described in full what he did every night during the darkest month. He has implied it. He has approached it. He has said things in interviews that make the shape of it visible without quite giving it a name. Because the darkest month belongs to him. It always has. And the music he made in it, private, unrecorded, played in the dark and heard by no one, It is the most honest thing he has ever done, the most direct, the most complete, and the most completely invisible part of the story of what it cost Roger Taylor to be present for the end of the most important creative relationship of his life. What Queen never talked about is not one thing and not a decision made in a meeting. It is the accumulated consequence of people who understood that the most private moments of an extraordinary loss do not become public property simply because the person at the center of the loss was famous. Freddie Mercury was famous. His illness was a public event. Eventually, his death was reported around the world. The tribute concert was watched by billions. But the nights that Roger Taylor spent alone with a drum kit in the weeks before the death, the specific, private, unperformed grief of a man processing the impossible through the only language fully available to him, those nights were his. They remain his. And the reason Queen never talked about them is the same reason that Freddie Mercury spent his entire career insisting on the separation between the private person and the public one, because some things are more valuable precisely because they are not shared. Because the privacy of grief is not a failure of honesty, it is a form of dignity. And Roger Taylor's darkest month, played out in the small hours, heard by no one, was one of the most dignified things that any member of Queen has ever done in the name of the friendship that defined all of their lives.